So today we're really excited to continue our organizing session through the Democratic National Committee for organizing and mobilizing for the 21st century electorate. And today we have a special guest with us, Rabbi Josh Lesser, who has proudly served as a senior rabbi at a progressive and creative synagogue congregation, Bet Haverim, for 24 years and has recently become Rabbi Emeritus. He is the co-founder and president of Bridges Faith Initiative, a new nonprofit promoting the rights, protection, integration of immigrants and refugees and advocating for U.S. policies to ensure civilian security worldwide. He is excited about his upcoming work with the Civil Conversations and Social Healing team of On Being as a spiritual director for their new Fellowship for Social Healers. He has been a committed advocate for racial justice issues on issues of mass incarceration, bail reform, and challenging systems of white supremacy. He is the rabbinic editor of Torah Queries, a weekly Bible commentary which explores LGBTQ themes throughout the Hebrew Bible, and the founder of the Southern Jewish Resources Network for Gender and Sexual Diversity. He is the former chair of the City of Atlanta's Human Relations Commission and currently serves as on the mayor's LGBTQ advisory board. He will soon work with the Civil Conversations and Social Healing team of On Being as the social director. He is the first Jewish president of the Faith Alliance of Metro Atlanta, and Rabbi Josh is committed to building bridges between people of all faiths. And at the center of his faith practices advocacy for justice and the pursuit of healthy democracy that is involved in reparative and progressive ideals. And so I'm really excited to introduce him and to have him with us to speak about the book On the Right Side of History, 100 Years of LGBTQI Activism. Rabbi Josh?
Thank you, Nadia. I appreciate it very much. And friends, please call me Josh. And I want to begin by just saying that it's really a pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon, and hope that we're a small, intimate group, and so I'm hoping that we can actually engage in some dialogue and conversation together rather than me lecturing for half an hour about this book. But one of the wonderful opportunities was, in saying yes to Nadia, was the opportunity to read a book that I don't think I would have otherwise, and it has felt really important. On the Right Side of History, which in some ways, I'll start by saying, while I was fascinated by this book and many of the portraits of the LGBTQ folks within it, I don't love the title, because in many ways I think it doesn't quite express the extraordinary nature of what I think this book is all about. And I think that part of what I feel like I witnessed in reading this book was kind of the individual architecture of people's process of becoming an advocate, an activist, even an ally for many different issues through the exploration of their own kind of political need to secure their civil and human rights, and often doing it in a pretty bold and exciting and sometimes even disruptive way. And so On the Right Side of History, which is something I feel like could be described by many different parts of our movement, kind of feels like a very bland title for a pretty exciting, dynamic view of so many different important activists' lives, where I felt both in touch with my own story, and so I would love to hear a little bit about each other's stories, and I'm happy to share with you some of mine, but also felt really inspired and humbled by those who came before me, and just realizing how many unsung folks it takes to build a movement, and really the things that set things in motion. So one of the reasons why this book felt really meaningful to me is that I was born in 1969. And so I've always tracked my life with the Stonewall movement. And, to feel like I was born when Stonewall occurred, I really feel very linked with my queer history as a way to understand my own path and the freedoms that have been afforded me up to the point, and also the freedoms and rights that I have worked for as well, including making great strides within the realm of religion, which, of course, marriage equality, which is kind of where the book takes us through as it ends in 2015, that it ends up kind of detailing a lot of my own life. And so being able to see this, I really felt like I understood how I was the benefits of so many other people's work. I think that for me also that this book explains from a political sense of both why I prefer to identify as a queer man and have since my early 20s. And in some ways, certainly in my rabbinical school, I was the first. There was one gay man who was accepted the year before me, and he was a very mild-mannered student, whereas I came in a very young, and he was about a decade older than me. I came in at 23, already an activist. I'd been involved in ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, albeit I was in New Orleans. I think when people hear ACT UP, they think of a pretty radical group, and perhaps by New Orleans standards, it was radical. But I jokingly say that we were the most polite ACT UP in all of the United States at that point, where we were really we were taking bold stands, but I think I appreciated being with a group of people that were very interested in not just the disruptive nature of what it was that we were trying to do to bring attention to the AIDS crisis and the invisibility of people who were dying, particularly those who were poor and those who had been overlooked, even at a time, I'm talking about the early 90s already. There had been a number of years where that kind of work of advocating for people living with AIDS and HIV had been doing their work. And so when I came onto the scene, we were already beginning to notice, for instance, that women were not included in many of the clinical trials, and really wanting to bring attention to expanding those who had been invisible in a group that already was invisible. And so not only were we disruptive in important ways, but we also really were a group of people who examined both the consequences of our actions, not just the actions. We wanted the ends always to be in alignment with the means, and the means to be in alignment with the ends. And I also want to say is that also as a queer man that I realized that kind of label, and I felt it resonant in the book in many ways, that sometimes some of our labels can get in the way. And so it is for me, it's often been a very, what's the right word that I want to use? It has been a very deliberate choice to sometimes jettison the word queer because of the kind of reaction that it might get, to be able to actually to get to the work that needs to be done. And so in building lines, particularly in building connections and coalitions, particularly in the South, I would say that I saw in this book different strategies of how we build movements, and sometimes what does it mean to put one of our primary identities into, onto the back burner in some ways, as a way to be able to be more effective and to not let something that might be an obstacle for some people to obstruct us. And I saw a lot of people making these kinds of choices in the book. I also felt that there was this continued exploration of what a specific queer lens can bring to political advocacy and activism, that there is this understanding of clearly identifying as an outsider and taking an outside stance that can bring an important understanding. I think for me, it's really informed a sense of where I have privilege and the kinds of things that I want to do to be able to mitigate that privilege, and why I feel the urge to be a good, thoughtful, and sometimes even fierce ally to others, because of my understanding of that outside status. And I saw that again and again in this book. Having an access to our history, I felt like in this book, I was discovering people that I had not known, and I felt that it was liberating and inspiring. I read again and again that there's a loneliness on this path that many people forged, and while there was great satisfaction, as somebody might have heard that I'll be working with social healers with On Being, which is a podcast that maybe some of you are aware of. Krista Tippett is the amazing interviewer of that podcast. This is with a part of her team that is focusing on social healing. And so I'm somebody who is a firm believer, and I saw the kinds of pain of some of these people choosing this individual kind of path, that it felt like if there are ways that we as a community can do better to support each other in our own comfort and support of the things that we need, that loneliness doesn't need to be such a striking factor that gets repeated again and again. As I kind of said in the beginning, it had me begin to look at my own inner architecture of what are the layers that had me become the kind of advocate and activist that I am. And it made me aware of that, kind of one of the ways that I identify as a queer man is, there's this kind of understanding where the third wave of feminism was where feminism began to make a shift in this greater understanding of that women's rights and feminist values are human rights and human values, and that there's universal application, and that progress for women is progress for all human beings. And I would say that that is very much, I've kind of talked about it as the second wave, that I'm somebody who represents a second wave of queer activism. As the rabbi of a congregation that was founded by LGBT folks, and mostly LGB folks, and has welcomed, and was, I would say, the first congregation in the United States to be as welcoming to straight people and to build a very intentional experiment of creating a community of allies. There were times where, very much like the tension within the feminist community of, should we just be focusing on women, or should we be focusing on the universal application of these values? We were criticized as a congregation nationally for being post-gay. And I wrote about how post-gay is actually a good thing, that the universal values that queer folks are striving for, and I would say in the spiritual realm, which is often kind of a sense of one's authenticity and a claiming of an inner knowing of one's liberational path, is something that all people can benefit from. I used to jokingly say that straight people need welcoming synagogues too. And, and so over time, we became even more, it was 50-50, and now I think the congregation is probably 65% straight. And so some people really looked at this as the opportunity to, kind of say that we've deluded ourselves. But one of the things that have happened is that we have children who are growing up in this community, many of whom have had straight parents, but who have grown up in a congregation where they know that they are loved and accepted and affirmed for who they are. And so we have created a generation of allies and of queer kids who have come out with a spiritual community that has fully accepted them. And so for me, that's the kind of world repair and the vision of a world that really is important. And that alongside that has been a congregation that has been working towards the human and civil rights for many different groups of people, including LGBT folks. And so that there is already this understanding of how the spiritual side of our lives and the political sides of our lives don't have to be at odds, but really can forward this sense of liberation together. And lastly, I'll say, and kind of think in reading this book, I felt like that there's a way that our outsider status as queer folk give us strength and a perspective and a place from which to disrupt. But often I read time and time again that it barred people to be able to celebrate the success. That in some ways, folks who represented a more kind of mainstream insider approach ended up reaping those benefits. And I'm somebody who's really interested in exploring how how outsiders and insiders, and that's probably more of a binary than we need to kind of label, but just for now, but how there's a symbiotic relationship in terms of how change gets made. And so to have deliberate relationship and instead of being so critical of each other's strategies and tactics, but looking at how we can harness those together and appreciating them so that there's a fuller recognition of how we've claimed a number of our rights. So while Evan Wolfson, who I've heard speak many times and feel very grateful for his work, and certainly, some people would say he was radical. He had very, I would say, strategic, tactical, and less disruptive ways. For him, it was about building connections and a vision of being able to see gay marriage. There were a lot of people, I was part of groups that really said that marriage shouldn't be where we're focused on. I can see how much marriage has taken, how far we've come because of it. And so, I think that, I celebrate his strategies and his tactics, but there are also a number of groups like Queer Nation that paved the way for some of these kinds of possibilities. And so to be able to read a book like this and to understand, that's in a lot of ways where I feel like that there's an architecture here of how one thing builds upon the next and how we move back and forth feels really important. And so to take this lesson from this book of how, a general lesson beyond the LGBT community about how disruptive tactics and kind of within the halls of our legislature, we can bring and harness both of these approaches for a greater sense of change. So we are a small group, and I know most of us are off camera, but what I wanted to do is in reading these individual portraits and in thinking about both the foreword that was written by Dr. Jonathan Katz and Adrian Brooks, who was the editor, there are 4 questions that struck me that I thought might be helpful for us to discuss in thinking about how we might apply some of these lessons from this book into our own organizing and our own sense of commitment today. And so, in what I've been calling inner architecture, I'm curious if we can have a conversation that starts with, what is your inner architecture? What were your justice-seeking influences, particularly those movements adjacent to your primary identities? So I'll repeat that again. So I'm curious about what were your initial experiences that led you to justice seeking, particularly those movements adjacent to your primary identities? And in part, I ask this question because so many of the folks took their inspiration from either working with the Quakers on peace movements or from the labor movement, and then began to apply these. So Sharon, I see that you would like to respond. Love to hear what you have to say.
Well, I'm somebody who's in multiple communities out of necessity. Aside from being queer, there's also disability in my case, and there's also neurodivergence on my case. I'm definitely not neurotypical, though. I'm not exactly autistic. My brain definitely works a little differently. And as a result, I've always looked for other movements, generally because no one movement encompasses me. I automatically have to adjust whatever activism I'm doing, I have to remind them about the other piece of it. So I've been even though most of my work has been done in queer community, I have relied a lot on what ADAPT has done. A lot of the radical disability activism has informed and educated me, and I've brought a lot of that into my queer work, reminding about accessibility in our choices, in our activism, in our activities. So for me, that's been huge.
Really appreciate that. Thank you. Anyone else have any thoughts about your justice-seeking influences?
Hi everyone, my name is Richard Thripp, and I got involved in politics last year as a congressional candidate. Hey, could you mute the TV? And then I definitely became, an ally of various groups, especially with Black Lives Matter after we saw what happened with George Floyd, and with the LGBTQ community as a candidate, and then also as a school teacher and as a party chairman for a while. And so I see it's very important for even people who aren't a part of the community as a member to help people out and to represent, like you said, about the human rights being an issue, not just the what you were saying about the second wave. I just came on because Nadia invited us on a Facebook chat, so good to see you.
Really glad that you're here. I appreciate that. And that's exciting that you were a congressional candidate. I hope that is that something that you're going to continue to pursue?
Yeah, so this week I decided to run again. And so I've been working on that, and I have all the stuff already. And this time we're going to win the nomination and so I'm going to do it part-time though, because I'm going to be a special ed teacher starting in a couple weeks. Of course, now I'm worried about the COVID Delta variant as well. But yeah, I will continue because I think there's a big platform you get with it, which we saw last time, as to being able to advocate for people and issues and people hearing it.
And we're going a little bit perhaps afar, but I'm curious, have you done the Victory Fund training?
Oh, the Municipal Victory Fund? Or is that a different one?
I was thinking about the national Victory. The Victory Fund is is an organization that supports LGBT candidates. And
I haven't looked at it. Yeah, I should.
yeah, they have an institute that really is supposed to be incredibly helpful in helping candidates think through their entire campaign. I've known a number of people who have become candidates who have, really kind of felt emboldened by their training, and it really has led them to much more success.
Yeah, I'll look at it and see if I can get into that. That'd be great.
Sure, and I'll send Nadia the link, and she can forward that on to you.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. I'll just respond. In terms of, in a lot of ways, both what you and Sharon responded to also tracks for me. I would say that my first experience kind of working around rights for community came when I was a young child. My uncle was a special ed, phys ed teacher, and I went to visit him at his school. And through him, I began to understand the kinds of the importance of advocating for people with disabilities. And that informed actually what I did all throughout high school. I actually ultimately ended up starting a camp for children and adults with disabilities with a group of other folks. I was the one kind of teenager on the board. I jokingly say I was a much better fundraiser as a teen than I have ever been as an adult in raising this camp. But in being in proximity, understanding the many different barriers to rights and to needs that people with disabilities had, it really began to spark this sense of justice, alongside being Jewish, where there was, also a lot of understanding of the importance of religious freedom in its true sense, not in the kind of bills that we often see in this moment. And so paired with that, I ultimately became a special ed teacher as well. I did Teach for America, but in Teach for America, I also taught in an all-Black school as the only white man in the school, and that also began to open my eyes, even though I would say that I was influenced in many ways by the civil rights movement. Being from Atlanta, I was part of kind of the surroundings that I began to understand things, even though there wasn't a name for it then, but I understood in my school that there was a school to prison pipeline. And so I felt like the weight of the responsibility of the kinds of injustices of being now part of a system that needed to be re-envisioned in order to support people's well-being and future. And so that opened my eyes to poverty. And in many ways, all of that took me away, ironically, from going to law school, which I was planning to apply for, and to become a rabbi, because I felt like my desire personally to seek justice and freedom came from a spiritual place of wanting to connect around humanity. And so I would also say, before I did Teach for America, the other interesting thing is that I was the president of the Jewish Student Union, and that happened during the Gulf War. And I saw that both Arab and Muslim students were being harassed and harmed on campus. And so as the primary Jewish student leader, I began a campaign to support our Muslim and Arab students on campus. And so all of these kinds of things began to work together, that when I started coming out, it supported my own vision. But I saw these as interconnected, and I really appreciate how many people in this book kind of trace their interconnections in this web. Before I move on to the next question, I was curious, not to put you on the spot, Nadja, but I would love to hear if you have a thought about kind of your own justice seeking.
Yeah, I think for me, like two movements that kind of that resonated with me. One was a movements by Indigenous women to protect their lands, like for forests and to protect their areas. So there was, women like the Chipko Women's Movement in India. There's also the movement in Kenya for protecting forests as well. And so those really resonated with me because they were movements that were led by women who were like my grandmothers. And so I feel like that really, that was something that I gravitated towards, even though as someone in first world country, I felt like that need to protect these open spaces and protecting just basically trees was really crucial. And I think another movement that really resonated with me was the Black Liberation Movement. So even though that was really at the fore, during the 60s, I think they're also tracing back parts of it to Muslim activism during that time period was important. And I always felt like I was kind of like at the periphery of these movements because they don't really, as my background being South Asians, as being South Asian, I don't really get that thrust into politics. It's something that's kind of frowned upon in my community. So I saw seeing those two, even though they were very different in some respects, I saw that idea of being able to speak out and be authentic was really crucial.
I appreciate that you shared that. You reminded me that while I was the president of Hillel, I had the opportunity to do a Indigenous Jewish cultural exchange. And part of what I learned in that experience that I think that has always guided me is really there was a deep interest, curiosity, respect, and reverence, but there was also really helpful boundaries in terms of how to interact with each other's cultures so that we were not appropriating or exploiting, but rather figuring out how to be of support and to educate ourselves about one another. And so that for me has been a really important, and part of what we were doing there is that in Wisconsin, I continue to go back for the rest of my semester. In Wisconsin, like many other states, the indigenous community has specific rights that entitle them to hunt and fish in ways that aren't necessarily available to others given the treaties that they've signed. And so the local white supremacist organizations would come and protest during their spiritual, religious fishing rites, where they would go spearfishing. And it was the first time I actually saw, it was essentially like the Klan showing up. Everybody, except instead of wearing hoods, were hunting orange. And they, the police were often in collusion with them. They would make us walk a gauntlet. People would spit on us. And so for me, that there was this kind of like deep, it was the first time I felt like, oh, this is, kind of connecting to my next question, this kind of understanding of, I've read all of this stuff around what life was like in Germany, but I've never experienced what it could feel like in such a visceral way until I experienced the kind of hatred that I was with the Ojibwe Nation. And so, being with the Ojibwe people, to kind of see that and feel that, and to be somebody who was voluntarily witnessing and taking notes about everything that was happening, so that they could bring actions to court, felt really important way to be an ally. And also for there to be that spiritual connection, because what it ultimately had me understand, is why I didn't become a lawyer. I thought I wanted to do public policy and work in the inner city. But what I began to realize as I did Teach for America, and I think from this experience working with the indigenous community my last year in college, was I had been coming at it from the white hope perspective. And so it really was coming from all of the wrong reasons. And so part of why it was a spiritual calling is that I wanted to go back to the Jewish community and to build bridges that way and to make change within my community and raise that awareness. And ultimately, I was able to be in the intersection of serving both an LGBT congregation and a Jewish congregation, so that both my identities were able to come to the fore, and also explain why it wasn't just important that we develop allies to support us in our causes, but why we needed to be allies and to support racial injustice, living wage, greater protections for trans folks, et cetera. It just felt really, really important. And so part of what I wanted to invite us to talk about is what moments of our collective history have continued to inspire us. So I'd be really interested in, kind of looking at other things. Where in your own kind of community's history are you inspired? One of the things that I saw as the book went on is fewer and fewer people were truly pioneers, even though they were doing pioneering things, but really were understanding that they were on the shoulders of others. And so I was curious if people were comfortable sharing any of their own particular community's history that has been particularly meaningful to you.
I have something to share that's not, well, there's some that's specifically about me as well, but I had a student last school year, but it was an Ojibwe student, and so he shared a lot in class. I taught U.S. history 11th grade, and it was very interesting, especially with the questions for like the standardized assessments, to take them apart and look at them and see, well, they're saying this about the American Indian movement, but we had someone in the class who knew more about it than the test makers and said, well, that's not quite right, or to say that they were for violence isn't true. I guess also for myself, I'm actually half Chinese, and I don't know my language, which is the first question everyone asks. But nevertheless, so there is some, othering that you'll get from that. As to me, being half Chinese, my mother's from northern China. I was born in Daytona Beach, and I didn't get to learn the language. But at the same time, often you'll have people look at me and they're like, "Oh, what are you?" Like I remember as a young child at the playground being told, "Oh, you're a Mexican," like the kids being racist toward it. And I think it affects, it affects everyone. If you're not white, if you're anything but a white male, really, it affects everyone. A white straight male, I mean, I should say.
Yeah. I've recently been diving back into my Jewish identity more dramatically. I was pretty observant for a while, and I also thought I was straight and cis and going to do the whole traditional path. And when my health tanked and I had to really face myself, stepped away from that for a while and dove more into the queer and disabled pieces. And I've kind of found queer Judaism again. And I've been diving back into that. And I've been reading more about some of the Jewish activists of past generations who are in the labor movement. And, you know, folks who tried to fight for the rights of laborers before and after the Triangle Shirtwaist disaster. I only recently learned that not one, not two, but three different people I know have ancestral ties to the activists at the Triangle Waist factory. One of my friends is only alive today because his mother played hooky that day from work because she was meeting up with one of the organizers who was trying to unionize that factory. And that's the only reason my friend's father exists today, and the only reason my friend exists. So understanding the labor piece of things and the religious piece of things has tied into all this too. And I'm looking for the less famous folks who are recorded in the work, but who aren't necessarily the ones who led the marches or who got all the newsprint. I'm finding those folks more interesting because that's with my limitations. If I'm going to do anything, it's going to be the quieter, less obvious stuff. And I want to understand the folks who moved the folks up front, the folks who made it possible for the ones in front to do what they did. I think that's going to be my role in all this, and I want to understand how to best do it.
I guess I wanted to add in also, so like in terms of like collective history, last week my parents had me from their house take all my notes. Like I saved all notes from like college and middle school and high school. So I was just going through them, and one of the classes I took was a class in American cultures. And I remember I would always go in a little late to the class. I'd have to sit on the floor, but it really kind of, that class really changed like the way I looked at things and the way I saw myself as well, because a lot of it focused on California history, like the history of farm workers' rights, immigrants' rights, as well as the Watts rights, and what like the history of activism and unrest in California. And being from Florida, I wasn't familiar with a lot of that history. And what really kind of hit me was when they were discussing about Cesar Chavez. One of the first people to actually die as a part of these protests was somebody who had a Muslim background, and I think there was about 5,000 people or so who at his funeral were a part of that. And to see like the people from the part of the world that I'm from also part of this American history was also like really important for me to see that, it's not just I'm an observer of it, but like it's something that I can also be a part of.
I appreciate that. And I think what everyone's been saying is incredibly important in terms of the kinds of inner almost handles that we can hold on to as we continue our work. When I think about my Jewish identity, there was an educator in Warsaw named Janusz Korczak, who basically created both an educational philosophy that was saying that every child should be understood and be put in an educational environment that allows their unique authenticity to thrive. And so in some ways, he was an intrepid educator He created an orphanage where he would employ these kinds of tactics. So it was a very positive community. He ended up being very well loved within the larger community, so that when the Nazis came, they actually offered him kind of amnesty to get him out, and he chose to stay with his students. And so ultimately, he was sent to the camps along with them. And there are some kind of legendary pieces, but it always struck me. He's somebody that, often when people ask who's one person you would want to meet from history, he's one of the people that I will often say, there's a certain kind of nobility that is attached to his story. But what's been more important to me is, along with his activism and along with his understanding, is both central to each person being able to be seen and heard. And that feels really important, kind of starting with children. And then I think even more so, his approach was very relational. And as somebody who started out as an activist, where I severed lots of relationships and, perhaps for very good cause, I am somebody who really feels that unless there is some imminent threat of physical violence, I'm somebody who wants to hang in with people as long as I can, to bring about that sense of change and to try to understand people where they're coming from. I understand, for me, sometimes my privilege as a white man allows me to actually move into spaces that others might feel unsafe. And so I realize this isn't a path that everybody can feel like is afforded to them. But I think even more so, it feels really important that I'm somebody who believes that redemption is possible, and that comes from my tradition, that people can change, that there is a way where a hopefulness that I feel like continues to inspire me, even when over the last, the previous 4 years, and even more so, even under the Obama administration, for instance, when there were many of the kinds of progressive changes that I'd hoped to see were slow in its movement and sometimes not happening at all. This kind of continuous sense of hope kind of comes from this place, this sense of relationship building. One of the other things that I saw, which in so many of these stories, which felt a little bit more painful, is that, and I think actually Jonathan points it out in one of his quotes in the foreword, where basically he talks about how a number of times people are invisibilized, or they have to minimize a part of their identity. When I think about Bayard Rustin and Bayard Rustin's story in the civil rights movement, really, in many ways, the key architect to the nonviolence component to King's vision. It's often, often when we talk about Kingian nonviolence, we're really talking about a Bayard Rustin version of it. And in part, a lot of Bayard Rustin's identity as a queer man, which was part of his first steps towards his own kinds of activism, gets erased or is put on the back burner. And I think I even said that I'm somebody who has often kind of muted my queer identity to be able to work with other groups or organizations for a specific cause. There have been different religious organizations who have worked, let's say, against the death penalty. And I'm somebody who has done a lot of anti-death penalty work. I've known that who I am as a queer man confronts their own theology. And so while everybody's aware of who I am, it's not something I have necessarily made visible. I'm so visible that it isn't something that anybody could deny, but I haven't put it front and center in order to be able to do that death penalty work. That doesn't make that choice any less painful when we're not able to show up as our full selves. And so I'm curious, when do you feel that a core part of who you are is made invisible, engaging in political change? Or do you consciously choose to minimize an aspect of your identity in order to do the justice work that's important to you. So I'm curious about when you've had that experience, or when you've consciously chosen to do so. Because I feel like it's a pretty common experience.
I live in South Florida. So I'm also in the process of the disability benefit application logistics and getting that approved. So I have to kind of, even though I physically cannot work a full-time job, I mean, I almost didn't make it here today. I'm so dizzy, having one of those days that can't, hang on a second, I couldn't even think about getting behind the wheel today, kind of dizzy. And it's, I have to play that down sometimes to do what I do. I've had to take on work that sometimes I have to say up front, I want to do this. I can't promise I can do this by this deadline. You know, it depends on how many good days I have between now and then, kind of thing. I don't have a choice in some things, playing up or playing down, but the queer thing, the non-binary thing, none of it's obvious. I'm not somebody who people look at and say, oh, that's who you are. So I'm strategic about it. Sometimes I intentionally don't play that up. I know I'm in a space that's predominantly hetero, predominantly cis, and I will slowly drop bits and bits of that until people finally pick up the pieces, because then I use the opportunity for them to see I'm not really as different as they thought. You know, a lot of what they see as difference is the assumption. So sometimes I use it strategically, and sometimes for my safety. And sometimes so people think I am disabled as I am, because on good days I don't look it.
Right. No, I wrote an article about the commonalities in some ways of the disabilities community and the LGBT community, because for many of us, not all of us, there is that potential of passing that that ends up having the onus be on us to figure out to what degree are we even just going to be disruptive by just saying who we are, and how much emotional labor and sometimes the threat of our own safety of just claiming that. Whereas, as somebody who, visibly wears a yarmulke in many places and many spaces, I then, become visibly identified as Jewish. Whereas, in some ways, I sometimes wonder, do I not realize how unsafe I am, given, for me, in some ways, this isn't a choice. It is part of how I express who I am in the world. And so I think that there are those kinds of choices, and when we make them, when would I take my yarmulke off for my own safety? What would that feel like? Has always been, and I think, the one time was in order to listen to someone, to a Palestinian speaker in the West Bank, where I knew that my yarmulke would end up being really confronting in a way that would have derailed the entire thing. And so, but that again, it's that conscious choice, and it always means giving up some aspect of who we are, in terms of being able to hear another's narrative. And I'm somebody who wants to create that space, so I'm willing to make that choice.
Josh, I'd like to share.
Oh yeah, please.
Hi, sorry I can't be on video. Our internet at home isn't very strong. I live in Virginia Beach, and it's interesting because I also ran for a public office. I lost my primary for delegate like a month and a half ago, but I think for me, my narrative, it wasn't until I was campaigning did I actually, it's like the opposite of what you're talking about, where I used my difference as a way to advocate, which that wasn't really the reason, I don't think consciously, why I was running. Like, I'm Filipino American and I'm a woman, or I guess cisgen woman. And yeah, just throughout the process, I mean, I didn't know that I was the second person of color to run, to represent my area, and then the first Filipina American. And in the campaign, they were like, just really lean in to that part of your narrative. And then also, I mean, I'm studying to be a special ed teacher. So,
Mm.
and that was like the impetus for my running for office, because I was a part of the efforts to advocate for staff within the public schools who weren't being listened to, where they felt like it wasn't safe to teach in person. And my coworkers who were older as aides didn't feel listened to. And that's where, it was in that crisis did I feel that I needed to speak up, because I wasn't in the system, like in the public school system long. So I felt like, yeah, I don't have a lot to lose where other people may have their pensions or, this long career. So yeah, just sort of leaning into those aspects as a minority, in every way, whether it's my heritage, my gender, or even, a minority within the schools being, a substitute and not like a full-time staffer, leaning into those, I guess, I don't know if that would be, I guess underrepresented in the majority, leaning into those parts of the narrative. Yeah, collectively, I guess they help create a space for others who can relate to me. Does that make sense?
100%, absolutely. No, and I appreciate you bringing that up, and I'm really fascinated by the special education thread that's run through, and congratulations for running, and I hope that's something that continues to grow within you.
Yeah, thank you. This is awesome to be a part of this group, and it's so intimate. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your stories. It is important to, like, for us to find new language and new support systems, even if it's, for an hour. It's very meaningful, and it makes a big difference. So thank you for you guys for hosting this and for sharing.
And as somebody who has chosen to be as visible as a queer activist in many other ways, and where I've leaned into that, what it has enabled is that in a lot of communities where LGBT Christians or LGBT Muslims who have had nobody to come speak to found me. And so actually, less so today, but in my first 10 years, so around 1999 to 2010, there were a number of folks of other religions who were struggling with how do they kind of find their own sense of spiritual connection, and and thankfully I'm part of a tradition that doesn't proselytize. So the conversation was never about, oh, you should become Jewish. It was really about supporting people to kind of affirm who they are in the fullness of not having to have those identities pitted against. And so definitely I would often say that for me, the strength, as you were saying, Tracy, is much more about leaning in than leaning out. But I was just so struck by how these very secure, formidable people often were either invisibilized or written out of some of the history, or they themselves chose to minimize certain aspects in order to do other work that was important to them. So now, as we are nearing the end, I didn't know if you wanted to kind of give the final word.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why I, reached out to you Rabbi Josh, is really because I felt like, even as a Muslim in this political organizing space, there wasn't like the type of engagement needed for spirituality. Like it felt in some ways is that it was either very superficial or it was like we were being pitted against each other. But I felt, in meeting with you and other activists, the interfaith community in Georgia, like there was an actual acceptance of, this is where we are and this is where we are, but and that, we're all going to embrace each other as a, and still move forward for a common goal. And I felt that was really empowering to be a part of that. And so I really appreciate you also, being a leader and on so many different levels, and not just like in this political organizing space, but also for the faith work that you do, as well as for LGBTQI issues. I think it's really important, to be able to respect each other and also see that how our humanity is linked with this idea of dignity. And by being able for everybody to have human dignity is so crucial and so important for that. So I wanted to leave you all with those words. And also, Rabbi Josh, if you had anything, last few words I wanted to leave for you.
Absolutely. And just responding to what you said, I think that I said yes to this invitation because I deeply appreciate that you are somebody who visibly demonstrates their faith and does the work together and is able to hold such a strong vision for a collective well-being, a common good. And, and that for me feels really important and is political, is spiritual, is religious. And I kind of make those three things. While they have a really strong Venn diagram, maybe justice is in the center of that. But that, it feels really important to support other folks who are doing that as visibly as you are. And I'll just close by saying that the book that I read, I thought, unfortunately, downplayed the spiritual aspect of people's religion. One of the things I saw is that time and time again, if somebody was Jewish, it was just invisible in the book. And that just felt like a little bit of a pain. Edie Windsor belonged to Congregation Beit Simchat Torah. Her Judaism was an important part, which undergirds part of her commitment to marriage. Even the ways that people talked about the editor, Adrian Brooks, as a Quaker, and Bayard Rustin as a Quaker. They talked about the political ramifications of being a Quaker and the nonviolence, but not necessarily the spiritual implications, which I actually think are as important. And I felt what was missing in many ways were the religious kind of voices. There was a person who was talking about queer, Black, and Muslim, and in the book there's one essay. But it didn't talk about how the richness and the strength of Islam was something that was the kind of motivating force of their own understanding. Rather, in which I can understand, it was more about how these identities are in tension, rather than how they ultimately can support each other, which I've been able to see in so many different kinds of approaches. And I think that's the spiritual aspect of our faith traditions. And so I know that politics and spirituality can feel somewhat threatening. I ultimately feel like when we have a sense of well-being and common good, and we want to help people live meaningful lives, for me, that is why I chose to do this work as a rabbi, because to me, it does feel like at the end of the day, this is spiritual.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you again, Rabbi Josh. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Richard, Sharon, Cookie, and Tracy. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing those of you who can make it for our program next week. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful.